The first thing they saw was the rope still swaying, a slow pendulum above the crushed shell driveway, its shadow brushing back and forth across the white glare of noon like a black finger trying to erase something it had written by mistake. Heat devoured the air that morning in 1853, a wet, meaty heat that pasted linen to skin and made the oaks along the avenue weep sap the color of old blood. Yet the rope itself was dry, almost thirsty, the hemp fibers standing out like brittle hairs on a corpse's chin. Below it the gravel had been raked only an hour earlier, but already a faint corona of dark speckles ringed the place where the man's shadow had once fallen, as though the earth had opened microscopic mouths to drink what little life had spilled. No body swung there now. The body had been cut down at dawn, dragged by the ankles to the cane fields, and burned in a pit so shallow that by the time the sun reached its xenon, the tips of charred phalanges protruded through the cinders like the first obstinate shoots of some new black crop. What remained in the air was not the smell of combustion, sugarcane trash smothers most odors, but something older, sweeter, the ghost of molasses that had once dripped from the grinding house and soaked the soil until every rain reawakened it, so that even the breeze tasted of unpaid labor. Visitors later claimed they heard the rope before they saw it, a faint creaking that seemed to come from inside their own skulls, the way a memory of a lullaby will sometimes start up when the singer has been dead for years. They would look up, find the noose still turning, and feel the ground tilt a few degrees, as though the plantation itself leaned toward the hole that had been cut in its sky. No one ever explained why the overseer ordered the rope left there, why the knot was never slipped, why every passing wagon was forced to drive beneath that empty circlet. Perhaps he believed the sight of it would settle the quarter, the way a wedding ring is supposed to settle a bride. Instead, the quarter grew watchful. Hoes hesitated mid-swing, children stopped their play to count the rotations, and women singing at the wash place lowered their voices until only the rhythm remained. A wet shirt slapped against a board like a distant drum announcing a king whose name no tongue dared pronounce. By the time the master's widow stepped onto the upper gallery that afternoon, the rope had completed 43 slow turns. She counted them aloud, her lips moving like those of a communicant rehearsing a sin too large to confess. And then she turned her back on the avenue and went inside, pulling the shutters closed as if night could be induced by sheer unwillingness to see. The house had been built in 1817, a square, austere block of brick made on the place by people who had not been paid for the clay or the firing, its windows tall and narrow like the slits in a confession booth, its front door a single slab of cypress sawn from a tree that had taken 4 men a week to fell and that had screamed, they said, when the teeth bit in. Inside, the air was always 10 degrees cooler, not from any architectural grace, but because the walls stored the breath of everyone who had ever stood inside them, sighs settling like sediment until the atmosphere itself grew thick with human weight. The widow's footsteps echoed differently since her husband's death. Where once the heel of a man's boot had struck the heart pine boards with the certainty of deed and title, her slippers now produced a dry whisper, the sound of paper sliding across paper, as though she walked upon unpaid bills. She had been married at 17 to a man twice her age, whose brows met in a single bar across the bridge of his nose, a feature that made him resemble the portraits of judges that lined the upper hall, men who stared out from cracked varnish as if still deliberating whether anyone in the present century had yet atoned enough to merit release. In the early years she had borne 3 children, but only one had drawn breath beyond the first frost. The others lay beneath a marble slab so thin that when the river wind blew hard, she could hear the stone flecks, a faint click like a teaspoon tapping the side of a porcelain cup. The survivor, a boy named Julien, had grown into a sullen, watchful child who preferred the company of the yard dogs to that of the tutor imported from Charleston. By 12, he could ride any horse on the place, but he could not recite the Lord's Prayer without stammering on the word trespasses, as though the syllables tasted of something he had been warned not to swallow. When the master died, his heart stopping mid-sentence while he read aloud from a ledger, the pen still scratching for 2 more letters before the hand realized, the widow had felt nothing at first except the draught from the open window, a sudden coolness across her collarbone that she mistook for relief. Relief had turned, within weeks, to a sensation more akin to being buried upright. The plantation's daily needs continued to arrive at her door like coffins delivered in advance of plague, each one demanding that she climb inside and nail down the lid herself. She learned to sign her husband's name better than he had, the loops of the capital H widening into a noose of ink, and she learned to listen for the sound of the driver's horn not as music, but as the audible form of debt compounding in real time. The place was called Saint-Hermance, though no saint by that name had ever been canonized. It was a corruption, the priest said, of Saint-Hermance, patron of commerce, but the slaves who had first cleared the cane pronounced it Hermance, accent on the second syllable, which to their ears sounded like haunt us, and the name stuck because it was accurate. 1,800 acres of alluvial soil lay between the levee and the cypress swamp. Soil so black it reflected faces like a dark glass, so that when one walked the furrows at twilight, it appeared as if a second, inverted world lay just beneath the crust, populated by mirror selves who had learned to breathe dirt. Sugar was the crop, and sugar was a religion. It demanded human blood at every stage, from the planting that blistered palms, to the grinding that tore off fingers, to the boiling that scalded flesh into pink ribbons curling atop the syrup like the first delicate shavings of a newborn. The house stood at the northern boundary, facing the river so that every boat passing to New Orleans could see the symmetry of its chimneys, the white paint mixed with ground rice to make it gleam like a grin between parted lips. Behind the house, the land descended in a gentle terraced slope toward the swamp, each terrace a decade's retreat from flood, so that archaeologists later claimed they could read the history of the place in layers of discarded cane knives, rusted ankle bells, and teeth that had been knocked out for speaking too loudly in a language the overseer did not own. By 1853, Saint-Hermance had already consumed 4 generations of the same families, their names recycled every 20 years, father, son, grandson, answering to the same syllable shouted across a field, so that time itself seemed to fold, yesterday and tomorrow stitched together by the same whip whose leather had outlived the cow. The widow had been born here, married here, and would almost certainly die here, yet she could not walk from the kitchen to the garçonnière without feeling that the ground was rehearsing the moment it would open and show her the bones it had kept in trust. She had never crossed the levee to the quarters after sunset. Her husband had forbidden it, claiming the night air carried fevers, but the real fever was memory, and it traveled not by mosquito, but by eye contact, by the way a woman nursing her child stared just past the mistress's shoulder as if an earlier version of the same white woman stood there, barefoot and screaming. The rope, then, was only the latest punctuation in a sentence that had begun decades before her birth, but it was the first that had been left standing for her to reread every day, and each rotation added another clause. On the 3rd morning she ordered the housemaid to draw her bath early, before the sun had dried the dew, and while she soaked she listened to the creak of the noose transmitted through the still air, a sound so regular it could have been the heartbeat of the house itself. She found herself counting again, 24, 25, until the numbers lost meaning and became instead the names of children she had never born, each digit a small ghost tapping at the inside of her ribs. When she stepped out of the copper tub, the water was the color of weak tea, and she wondered whose skin had tinted it, whose sweat had risen in thin bronze lines along the porcelain lip. She dressed without calling the girl back, fastening the stays herself, her fingers clumsy as if they had been borrowed for the day. At breakfast, she could not swallow the hominy. It tasted of the rope, of hemp, soaked in river fog, and she pushed the bowl away so sharply that the spoon spun and pointed toward the window, toward the avenue, toward the place where the man had danced his last jig of air. She decided then that the rope must come down, not because it was cruel, but because it was articulate, and she feared that sooner or later it would shape the thing it had been trying to say ever since the overseer first tossed it over the limb. She walked downstairs, through the parlor where the wallpaper, imported France, pattern of cornucopias, had begun to peel in long strips that curled like parchment, and out onto the gallery, her heels striking the boards with a new authority, the sound of a woman who has at last identified the exact weight of her own trespasses. But when she reached the top step, she saw that the driveway was no longer empty. A group of field hands stood in a half circle around the hanging tree, their heads bowed, their bare feet white with dust, except where blood had darkened the creases from cuts dealt by cane leaves sharper than any blade the law allowed. Among them stood a woman the widow recognized, May, the driver's wife, whose left eye was milk-white from a blow delivered so long ago that the story had calcified into rumor. She had looked at the master's son the wrong way, or she had looked the right way too long, no one could remember which. May held something in her arms, something wrapped in a scrap of indigo cloth, the same shade as the widow's own riding habit. The bundle did not move, yet every few seconds May rocked forward on the balls of her feet, a motion so small it might have been the reflex of someone standing on a deck anticipating swell. The widow's voice died in her throat before she could shape the woman's name. Instead, the air carried the creak of the rope, 49, 50, and she understood, without evidence, without need, that the bundle was the size of a full-term child, and that its stillness was not the stillness of sleep. She gripped the railing, the paint flaking away beneath her palms like dried calyx, and felt the house tilt a degree or two, just enough to remind her that bricks remember every weight they have ever borne, and that they adjust their posture accordingly. Down below, May lifted her face. The milk eye caught the sun and glowed like a candle seen through a keyhole, while the good eye fixed on the widow with a look not of accusation but of completion, as if a ledger had at last been balanced by the entry of a final figure written in red. Then the woman turned, the others parted, and together they walked back toward the quarter, their footprints overlapping so precisely that it appeared only one set of soles had ever pressed the dust, a single creature moving backward into the past, erasing its tracks even as it made them. The rope continued its slow revolution, but now the widow could see that it turned not with the wind, there was none, but with the same patient torque that twists a key in a lock when the hand on the other side of the door already knows what waits in the room. She descended the gallery steps one at a time, each tread releasing a sigh from the heart pine as though the boards had learned to imitate the breathing of whoever stood upon them, and when her heel touched the shell driveway, the fragments of oyster shifted and crackled like tiny bones grinding under the world's invisible millstone. The sun had climbed high enough to burn the last softness from the sky, yet the air felt colder the nearer she drew to the rope, a pocket of winter trapped inside summer, the way a body sometimes preserves the chill of a river long after the clothes have dried. She reached up, fingers tentative as a girl touching a stove for the first time, and found the hemp surprisingly supple, as if it had absorbed the sweat of the neck it had embraced and now carried that salt forever. A private scripture legible only to scarred skin. But the moment she closed her fist around the cord, she felt a tremor travel down through the limb overhead, a shudder that began in the cambium and ended in her wrist, and she understood that the tree had no intention of surrendering what had been offered to it. The rope was merely the root. The real fruit hung somewhere deeper, in the dark galleries of sap and ringed memory. She let go, stepped back, and saw that the noose had turned toward her like a face awakening, the knot swollen into an eye that had learned to recognize its maker. And for an instant she smelled not molasses, but iron, the iron of a skillet left empty on the hearth until it glowed the color of a setting sun seen through a blood clot. Behind her the house waited, its windows watching with the indifference of portraits whose subjects have already died and been mourned and replaced. Yet she felt the gaze upon her shoulder blades like the flat of a blade held steady before the drawing of blood. She turned, meaning to summon the overseer, to demand that he fetch a ladder and a knife and cut the thing down before supper. But the words died again, because the driveway was no longer empty. The dust had begun to receive its visitors. They came singly at first, then in pairs, emerging from the cane brakes as if the rows themselves were giving birth, women mostly, their skirts the color of earth after rain, their heads bound in cloth the same indigo as Aimé's bundle, so that they seemed fragments of twilight walking at midday. None spoke. Speech had been pruned from them generations earlier, but their feet found the same rhythm, a slow brush step that left no imprint on the shells, and as they passed beneath the noose, each lifted a hand, not to touch, only to measure, then let the arm fall again, the gesture as precise as the dipping of a wick into tallow. The widow stood aside, or tried to, yet the line divided around her the way water divides around a stone that has dropped suddenly into a stream, and she felt the current of their passing tug at her sleeves, her hair, the folds of her skirt, as though they were reclaiming threads that had once belonged to them. When the last woman had gone by, she saw that they had left something in the dust, not an object, but an absence, a perfect circle of darker earth where the sun had not been allowed to fall, and at its center a single cane cutting, fresh, its joint beaded with sap that looked like milk, too newly drawn to have tasted air. She knelt, picked it up, and the sap dripped across her palm, viscous, warm, and she remembered, without wanting to, the way her husband had once described the process of bleeding the cane. How the stalk must be cut low, how the juice rises in panic, how the sweetest liquor is obtained not from the first pressing, but from the second, when the fibers have begun to understand that they will never again see the sky. A sound rose behind her, not the creak of rope now, but something looser, wetter, the unmistakable click of a tongue against teeth, and she turned to find Julienne standing 10 feet away, her son, though she had not recognized him at first because he was coated from crown to boot in the gray dust of the mill house, so that he appeared sculpted from ash, only his eyes unpowdered, 2 dark holes through which the plantation stared. He held something against his chest, a ledger, the same calfskin volume in which her husband had recorded weights and yields and punishments, but the pages protruded at odd angles, as if the book had been soaked and dried and soaked again. And when he extended it toward her, she saw that the edges were stained the color of damp rust. She opened her mouth to ask who they were, but the word dissolved. The ledger itself answered, its pages fluttering though no wind moved, revealing columns of numbers that had bled sideways, soaking through the ruling to form new shapes. Arcs, nooses, the silhouettes of bodies hanging by their wrists from rafters. Her husband's hand was unmistakable, those clipped verticals, the bar across the top of every 7 like a miniature gallows, but the ink had pooled in places to create eyes that stared up at her from inside the figures, and she understood that the book was not a record, but a confession, and that confession had been judged insufficient for absolution. Julianne's own eyes did not leave her face. They searched for something, permission, perhaps, or its opposite. And when she failed to speak, he stepped closer, close enough that she smelled the sour mash on his breath, the same mash fed to the dying ox to keep it standing long enough to be yoked one final day. Then he pressed the book into her hands, turned, and walked away. His footprints the first real marks left in the shells, deep and ragged, as though whatever walked inside the shape of her son was heavier than bone. She remained there, kneeling, the ledger in her lap and the cane cutting still oozing across her palm, while the rope above her completed its slow inventory of the sky, and she felt the hours pool around her like cooling wax, each layer sealing another fragment of sound, until the only thing left was the heartbeat of the tree, steady, patient, teaching the world how long a minute could be when it was paid for in interest compounded by silence. Evening arrived without ceremony, the sun simply closing its eye behind the levee. And with the darkness came the insects, first in 1s and 2s, then in clouds dense enough to dim the lantern on the gallery, their wings beating the air into a fine haze that tasted of copper and bruised fruit. She had not moved. The ledger had grown heavy as a child, its weight settling into her thighs until the flesh beneath went numb, and when at last she tried to stand, the shells shifted and gave a brittle sigh, as if the ground itself were weary of holding the same posture for centuries. She carried the book inside, past the parlor where the wallpaper had peeled further, the cornucopias now inverted, spilling nothing, and up the staircase whose banister had once been polished every Saturday by a girl named Celeste, who could sing in 3 languages but who had not been seen since the night of the last full moon. In the master's study, still called that, though the master was 7 months dead, she lit the lamp, set the ledger on the blotter, and opened it to the final entry, a date, a name, a weight in pounds of sugar rendered, and beside it, in the margin, a mark she had never noticed before, a tiny circle, perfectly closed, the ink fresher, as if added only after the page had dried. She touched it, and the circle transferred itself to her fingertip, a black halo that would not rub away, and when she held the finger to the lamplight, she saw that the circle was not solid, but composed of smaller marks, teeth perhaps or seeds, and that they were still moving, rearranging themselves into new configurations. A cradle, a coffin, a woman's torso split open like a pod. Outside, the creaking resumed, but softer now, almost companionable, the sound of a rocker on a porch where 2 old friends trade stories they have told so often they no longer remember which parts are true. She closed the ledger, but the circle had already entered the grain of the desk, sinking like a watermark, and she knew that the book had only been a messenger. The message itself was still arriving, carried by the night air, by the insects, by the faint sweet stink of the river that seeped through every crack in the brickwork and pooled beneath the floorboards like breath held too long. From the quarter came the low throb of a drum, not the jovial patting that sometimes accompanied Saturday corn shelling, but something slower, a heartbeat that had learned to keep time with the rope, and she felt the study floor pulse in sympathy, the carpet threads vibrating as if the house were being coaxed to remember a rhythm it had once danced to when the bricks were still mud and the beams still sap. She opened the window. The drum paused, then answered itself from a different direction, farther off, and she understood that the sound was traveling the same circuit the women had walked, a circle drawn and redrawn until the ground itself became a drumhead, every footfall a mallet striking skin. Above the drum rose a murmur, voices not singing but counting, the same numbers she had traced in the ledger, yet spoken as if they measured not pounds of sugar, but years of waiting, and the total grew larger with every repetition, a debt whose principal could never be reduced because the interest was compounded in flesh. She turned from the window, meaning to close the shutters, and saw that the mirror above the mantel had clouded, not with dust but with breath, the surface fogged in the shape of a handprint so large it could not have belonged to any person inside the house, the fingers stretching toward the reflection of the ledger as if to turn a page she had not yet reached. When she stepped closer, the glass cleared, but the print remained, etched now into the silvering, and in its center appeared a single word written backwards so that it could be read only from the other side of the glass, from the place where the dead stand when they wish to speak without being heard. The word was carry, and before she could puzzle out its grammar, the lamplight flickered, the flame drawing inward until it became a blue bead no larger than a pea, and in that contraction the room expanded, walls receding until she stood alone on a plain of darkness, whose only landmark was the rope, still turning, still counting, still teaching the world how long a minute could be when it was paid for in interest compounded by silence. And she understood that the ledger had never been a record of what had been taken, but of what had been promised in return, and that the time for collection had arrived. She woke before dawn with the taste of ink in her mouth, as though the word carry had crawled up through the inkwell during the night and dissolved upon her tongue, leaving its residue to dry into a film that made every breath taste of iron filings and wet pennies. The lamp had gone out. A bead of cooled wax clung to the wick like a tiny opal, and the ledger lay open to a page she did not remember turning, the columns now rearranged into a single vertical list of dates descending the left margin like a ladder whose rungs grew narrower the deeper they descended toward the bottom of the page. Opposite each date stood a weight, never less than 140 pounds, never more than 200, and beside each weight a name. But the names had been crossed through so thoroughly that the paper was bruised, the fibers swollen as if from repeated stabbings, and over the striations someone had pressed a thumbprint in dried blood, a seal whose whirls resembled the map of Saint-Hermance, seen from the height of a buzzard circling the cane. She touched the print and felt a pulse, faint but unmistakable, travel through the parchment into her own thumb, and for a moment the study vanished behind a red scrim inside which she saw the plantation at night, every window lit from within by a light the color of molten iron, while the fields lay dark except for rows of figures moving between the cane, each carrying on his or her shoulder a burden wrapped in the same indigo cloth that Aimée had cradled. They walked in silence toward the river, their footprints glowing briefly before fading, as though the ground itself were a manuscript written in disappearing ink, and when the last figure reached the levee the water rose to meet them, not in a wave but in a wall, perfectly vertical, its face inscribed with the same circle of teeth, seeds she had seen on her fingertip, only now the circle was large enough to swallow every name that had ever been spoken on the place. The vision snapped shut. She was back at the desk, her thumb still resting on the blood print, and she understood that the ledger was not content to be read. It demanded to be continued, the next entry to be supplied by whoever possessed the courage or the cowardice to finish the sentence. Downstairs, the hall clock struck 4, its chimes muffled as if the bronze were wrapped in flannel, and she realized that the sound came not from the pendulum but from the walls themselves, bricks shifting fractionally to release the accumulated pressure of every hour they had contained since 1817, each stroke a small exhalation of captive time. She rose, meaning to return the ledger to the safe, but the safe stood open, its iron maw breathing cool air that smelled of river mud, and inside lay not coin nor deed but a single object, a cane cutting, identical to the one she had found in the driveway, only this one had sprouted overnight, a pale rootlet curling from the joint like a blind worm, searching for the taste of grave. She lifted it, and the rootlet wrapped once around her finger, tightening with the polite insistence of a hostess securing a favor, and when she pulled away, a bead of clear sap welled up and dropped onto the ledger, landing precisely on tomorrow's date, blotting the numeral until it spread into a small blue sun. A noise rose from the direction of the kitchen, the scrape of a pot across the hearth, though it was too early for the cook to kindle a fire, and she followed the sound because motion felt safer than stillness, her bare feet finding the center of each board by memory to avoid the nails that sometimes worked loose in July and pricked the soles of anyone who presumed to walk unshod in a house built for shoes. The kitchen was dark except for the glow of the banked coals, but the coals had arranged themselves into a perfect circle, the same diameter as the thumbprint, and in their center sat the iron pot, lid slightly askew, exhaling a thin braid of steam that carried the odor not of food, but of damp earth freshly turned, the smell that rises from a new grave before the coffin is lowered. She lifted the lid. Inside lay another bundle of indigo, smaller than the first, tied with a strip of cotton so worn it was nearly translucent. And when she loosened the knot, the cloth unfolded like a flower filmed with frost, revealing a lock of hair the color of winter wheat, fine as corn silk, bound with a thread the exact shade of her own, clipped from her head the night before her wedding, and given to the maid who had dressed it, a girl named Thalia, who had vanished 2 summers ago while gathering mayhaws along the swamp edge. The hair had been braided into a tiny noose, complete with a slip knot small enough to fit around the stem of a wineglass, and beside it rested a single tooth, a child's molar still freckled with dried blood, the root intact and curved like a hook, baited for a species of fish that feeds on memory. She dropped the lid. The sound rang against the vaulted ceiling and came back altered, a note lower, as if the kitchen itself had grown a larger throat overnight. And when she turned to flee, she found the doorway blocked by Julien, his silhouette edged by the ember light so that he appeared to be cut from tin, a weather vane shaped like a boy but pointing nowhere. He did not speak. Instead, he extended his hand, palm up, the way a priest invites confession, and in the center of his palm lay a grain of raw sugar, perfect, cubed, glinting like a shard of quartz, and she understood that it was payment, the first installment on a debt whose terms had been negotiated without her knowledge, but for which her signature had already been forged in the womb. She brushed past him, climbed the stairs again, the cane cutting still wound around her finger like a green wedding ring, and as she reached the landing, the window at the end of the hall brightened, though the sun had not yet risen. A false dawn generated by the reflection of her own lamp on the glass. But in the reflection she saw not the corridor, but the quarter street, the cabins aligned like teeth in a jaw that had learned to close without biting. Women stood outside each door, wrapped in blankets the color of ash, and every blanket held a bundle, some large, some heartbreakingly small, and as she watched each woman lifted her bundle toward the sky, offering it to the rope that now appeared to stretch from the hanging tree all the way to the river, its other end vanishing beneath the water where the wall of liquid night waited, patient, exacting. She shut her eyes, but the image persisted on the inside of her lids, printed there by the same blue bead of flame that had shrunk in the study, and she felt the house rearrange itself around her. Corridors lengthening, doorways narrowing, the portrait eyes in the upper hall swiveling in their cracked varnish to follow the progress of a woman who had at last become a character in a story someone else was writing. When she opened them again, she was in her bedroom, though she had no memory of traversing the final steps, and the ledger lay on the coverlet, open to a fresh page headed with today's date, the ink still wet, the quill beside it balanced on its nib as though someone had just paused mid-sentence, waiting for the next hand to arrive and carry the account forward. Below the line waited an empty space large enough to hold whatever she chose to write, but the margins were crowded with the same thumbprints, dozens of them, overlapping until the paper resembled a sky full of eclipses, and she understood that whatever number she entered would not be measured in sugar or cotton or even flesh, but in the currency of absence, the weight of the whole a person leaves when the world finally finishes swallowing. She dipped the quill, the ink thick as molasses in January, and as the first drop trembled on the lip of the nib, the rope outside gave a sudden sharp creak, not the usual patient sigh, but a sound like a collar snapping, and she knew that the account was overdue, that interest had been compounding in the dark, and that the next installment would be collected not from the fields or the quarters, but from the ledger itself, from the hand that dared to close the book before the final reckoning had been tallied. The ink fell, blotting the page, and where it landed a second word appeared beneath Carrie, written not in her husband's hand, nor in hers, but in the rounded script of a child still learning to proportion letters. The word was mother, and it was written backwards, as if addressed to someone standing on the other side of the mirror, someone who had already stepped through and could not find the way back. She slept, or thought she did, sitting upright in the chair nearest the window, the ledger across her knees like a cat that had decided to stay and grow heavier with every hour, its pages rustling each time the house exhaled, a sound indistinguishable from the turning of a record kept by someone who could not decide whether to enter a birth or a death. When dawn finally leaked through the shutters, it carried no color, only a grayness that tasted of ash soaked in water and wrung out again, and she saw that the ink blot had dried into a perfect circle, ringed by a lighter halo, as though the paper itself had been branded by an iron, heated in a place where thermometers measured something other than temperature. She stood, meaning to wash, but the washstand pitcher was already filled, not with water, but with a liquid the shade of weak coffee into which a single drop of blood had been allowed to bloom, and when she tilted the vessel she saw at the bottom a layer of fine white crystals that dissolved the instant they touched air, leaving no residue except the faint sweetness of burnt cane drifting up like the ghost of a harvest that had never quite managed to end. She dressed without ringing for the maid, her fingers refusing the stays, letting the gown hang loose so that the fabric brushed her skin with the apology of something that had once been tight enough to teach a woman the circumference of her own breath. Downstairs the hallway smelled of lye and smoke, the odor of a kitchen where meat has been scorched to hide the taste of what the meat had fed upon, and she followed it because direction itself seemed a luxury she could no longer afford to choose. In the dining room the table had been set for three, a plate at the head for the master long buried, a plate to the right for the son who had not come in from the stables, and a third at the foot placed upside down, its rim resting in the saucer as though the guest were expected to dine upon the shadow of whatever had been served the night before. The widow lifted the cover from the nearest dish and found not food, but a layer of indigo cloth folded into a square so precise it might have been ironed, and when she unfolded it, she revealed a mound of raw sugar shaped like an infant curled in utero, the grains clinging together by means of some invisible syrup that glistened like the mucus of birth. Thalia, the maid whose lock of hair now circled her own finger beneath the skin, like a vein that had decided to grow toward the surface and declare its allegiance. She dropped the lid. The clang rang through the house and came back multiplied, echo after echo, each one softer but lower, until the final reverberation resembled not metal, but the thud of something heavy falling upon earth, packed hard by the repeated impact of bare feet. She left the table, crossed the back gallery, descended the servants' stair, and found herself on the path that led between the kitchen and the laundry, a walkway roofed by chinaberry trees whose fruit hung in clusters like tiny skulls, yellowed by prolonged exposure to regret. The path ended at the mouth of the lane that ran straight to the quarters, a lane rutted by iron-rimmed wheels and scarred by the hooves of mules that had learned to walk even while asleep. And as she set foot upon it, she felt the dust rise and cling to the hem of her gown, each particle a minute deed that had been ground so fine it could no longer be read, but still carried the taste of signature. Halfway along, she passed the first cabin, its door standing open, though the occupants had been sent to the fields at sunrise, and inside she saw the floor newly swept except for a circle drawn with white ash, the same diameter as the thumbprint, the same size as the mouth of the iron pot, and within the circle a single shoe, a child's, made of brocade too delicate to have survived a single day of play. Yet the sole was worn through as though the wearer had walked not upon ground, but upon the blade of a story that refused to end. She walked on, past cabins where similar circles waited, some containing a spoon, some a rag doll stuffed with hair the color of her own, some empty but for the indentation of a heel pressed into the packed clay, each absent shaped exactly like the thing that had been carried away. At the last cabin, the one nearest the swamp, she found the door closed and barred from within, yet smoke rose from the chimney carrying the odor not of cook fire, but of paper burning, the sharp, brief sweetness of ink being unwritten, and she laid her palm against the boards and felt the heat pass through the wood, the way fever passes through skin just before the rash declares itself. Behind the door, a voice began to count, not in English, not in French, but in the patois of the quarter, syllables that had been forbidden so long they sounded like a code devised by children to describe the shape of what had been stolen from them, and the count rose steadily, pausing only when it reached 141, the same figure inscribed in the ledger, before beginning again, slower, as though the speaker were learning the weight of each number by lifting it repeatedly. She left the door, followed the lane until it dissolved into the path that skirted the swamp, a path built upon a ridge of shells so old they had been ground into a powder fine enough to stain the air with the memory of the sea that had once covered this land before the river changed its mind and left the salt to crystallize into the foundations of empires built upon the backs of people who had once known the taste of ocean. Here the cane ceased, replaced by cypress knees rising like the knuckles of a giant buried upside down. And here the light changed, becoming green and aqueous, as though the world had been turned inside out, and the sky were now a pond through which the sun attempted to swim. She heard the drum again, though she could not locate its source. It seemed to rise from the water itself, a heartbeat that had learned to echo through the hollow trunks of tupelo and gum, and with every beat the surface of the swamp quivered, sending rings outward that intersected to form the same circle she had seen repeated throughout the morning, until the entire basin resembled an eye that had decided to keep itself open forever. On the nearest hummock stood a cluster of women, a May among them, their skirts hitched high, their bare legs coated with mud that gleamed like molten chocolate in the green light, and they were planting something, bending and straightening in unison, the motion so hypnotic that the widow felt her own spine sway in sympathy. She stepped closer, careful to keep to the ridge, and saw that they were planting cane cuttings, but not in rows. They arranged them in a spiral that began at the foot of a cypress older than the Republic and wound inward until the final cutting would be placed at the center of a coil so tight it resembled the spring inside a watch that had decided to measure something other than hours. Each woman worked with her eyes closed, yet their hands found the correct depth, the correct angle, and as they pressed the stalks into the muck, they sang under their breath, not a melody, but a single note held so long it became a thread, and the threads intertwined to form a rope invisible but strong enough to pull the air taut, so that breathing felt like walking against a current. Aimee straightened, turned, opened her good eye. The milk-white one remained fixed upon the spiral, but the other met the widow's gaze with a look not of defiance nor of welcome, but of recognition, the way one might greet a relative who has arrived too late for the funeral, but just in time to inherit the debt. She lifted her hand, beckoned, and the widow felt her feet leave the ridge, felt the powdery shells give way to the suck of mud, and she understood that the boundary between plantation and swamp had never been a levy but a debt, and that the debt had now been called, and payment would be accepted not in land or coin, but in the only collateral that had ever mattered, the weight of what remains when the body is subtracted from the name. The mud closed over her ankles with the slow courtesy of a host who has waited so long for the guest to arrive that politeness itself has grown heavy. She walked inward, each step releasing a sigh that rose through the spiral of cuttings like breath through the throat of a flute, and the women parted, their eyes still closed, their hands still planting, though now the stalks they set into the muck bore no resemblance to cane. They were fingers, ears, teeth, all the small currencies of identity that had been clipped and saved for this final deposit. Aimee stood at the center, the last bare patch of earth no wider than a dinner plate, and in her arms lay the indigo bundle. But it was no longer still. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the drum, the rope, the heartbeat of the tree, and as the widow approached, the bundle unfolded like a bud opening in time-lapse, revealing not a child but a mirror, oval, hand-sized, its surface blackened with mercury until it reflected nothing but the idea of reflection itself. Aimee lifted the mirror. The widow saw her own face, but the features had been rearranged, the mouth where the eye should be, the eye resting at the temple, a cubist portrait of someone who had been asked to wear her ancestors' bones on the outside of her skin, and behind the warped reflection moved shapes she recognized. The master, the overseer, the husband, all of them pinned like insects to the inside of the glass, still alive, still blinking, still trying to speak, but able only to move their mouths in the shape of the circle that had pursued her through every room of the house. Aimee spoke, the first words uttered since the counting began. The weight is complete. 141 pounds of what was taken. She gestured to the ground. The earth at the center of the spiral had risen into a platform of packed mud, smooth as bronze, and upon it rested a balance scale made of bone, the beam a femur, the pan's clavicles, the chain's braided hair, and in one pan lay a single grain of sugar, perfect, luminous, the same grain Julianne had pressed into her hand, only now it carried the heft of every unpaid hour, every unmarked grave, every signature forged in the dark. The widow removed her shoes, her stockings, her gown, until she stood in the shift she had been born into, the linen yellowed but whole, and she stepped onto the platform, felt the mud warm as fresh blood, and the scale dipped, the empty pan rising until it hovered level with her heart, and she understood that the measurement would be taken not of her flesh, but of her absence, the negative space she would leave behind when the account was closed. Aimee extended the mirror. The widow took it, felt the mercury burn cold against her palm, and the glass softened, flowing over her hand like a glove, climbing her wrist, her forearm, covering her entire body in a skin of liquid night, and beneath it her features dissolved, not into death, but into memory, into the archive of every touch that had ever been withheld, every name that had been erased, every child that had been born already in debt. The women began to sing, not with voices but with breath, exhaling in unison until the air itself grew solid, a column of sound rising from the spiral and carrying the mirror-sheathed figure upward, not high but deep, as though the sky were a pond into which she sank, and below her the plantation dwindled, the house, the tree, the rope, all shrinking to the size of a single entry in a book whose pages were now being turned by the wind itself. She passed through the blue bead of flame that had once been a lamp, passed through the circle of teeth seeds, passed through the word mother written backwards, and each layer stripped away another year, 1853, 1847, 1832, until she arrived at the year the first cane was planted and the first brick was laid, and there she stopped, suspended above the original furrow, watching the original hand press the original cutting into the ground, and she saw that the hand was her own, had always been her own, would always be her own, and that the debt had never been external but internal, a loop as tight as the noose that still turned overhead, teaching the world how long a minute could be when paid for in interest compounded by silence. The mirror sealed shut, the column of breath dissolved, the spiral of cuttings sank back into the muck, leaving no mark except the faint indentation of a woman's heels, side by side, perfect, weightless. On the plantation the house waited, the ledger opened to a final page blank except for a single circle of ink, perfectly round, already beginning to fade. The rope still creaked, but now it turned only when the wind remembered, and the wind remembered less and less. Years later, when the river changed course and swallowed Saint-Hermance, divers reported seeing 30 feet down a mirror lying face up on the silt, its surface black, its frame entwined with roots that looked like hair, and when they tried to lift it, the glass dissolved, rising in silvery threads that swam away like eels, leaving behind only the reflection of a woman standing ankle-deep in cane, holding a book whose pages fluttered though no wind moved, counting under her breath. 141, 141, while the scale beside her remained balanced, one pan empty, the other filled with a single grain of sugar that refused to dissolve, a sweetness that would never be tasted, a debt that would never be forgiven, a minute that would never be paid in full.